Story time with Stephanie.
Hi,
Story.
I am art historical novelist Stephanie Storey. Welcome to my show, Story Time, where I get to talk to other writers about their passions and process. My guest today is a former professional basketball player turned writer. Okay, so he's the author of two humorous memoirs, Can I Keep My Jersey and Stories I Tell on Dates. And he's also the founder of Writer's Block, which provides structure and community for other writers. I'm very much looking forward to finding out what he learned as a professional athlete and how he's applied that to his writing and other people's writing to improve the craft, because I'm obsessed with these things. Welcome to the show, Paul Shirley.
Thank you.
So you started out your career as a basketball player and then you become a writer. Was the writer thing always there and part of your life and something you wanted to do, or did it show up after basketball? How did that work?
It mostly came from being lonely. When I was a senior in college, I had a friend of a friend who was playing professional basketball in Spain, and he would write these humorous journal entries about what it was like to play basketball in Spain. And so I resolved at the time that if I ever got to play professional basketball, I would do something similar because it seemed fun. And then sure enough, my first year out of college, I had a basketball contract in Greece, and it was lonesome. I didn't know anybody. I didn't speak the language. And so I just started writing down the things that were happening, especially because the things that were happening were bizarre. You know, it was a weird gig. Like, no one in my family had ever played a professional sport. I hadn't even at that time been to Europe. So it seemed like there was a lot coming at me. And I found out that if I wrote emails that were funny, then people would respond to them. So I kind of developed this shtick where each week I would write down everything that had happened that week, compose it into something that made a little bit of sense, and send it out to a kind of listserv that started as 20 people or so, and then just grew and grew over the next 4 years as I continued to sort of roam the world playing professional basketball. And then when I was playing for the Phoenix Suns in the NBA, it was 2005, I think, and blogs were finally about to hit the world. And so the Suns website people asked me, would you write one of these blogs for us? I think thinking that I would just kind of like jot down some notes and they would craft it into something that was serviceable and readable. They didn't know that I'd kind of built up this ability to at least entertain people for 500 to 1,000 words. And so I knew like this was probably my chance. I had thought for a long time that I would someday write a book. I thought it would happen after my career, but sure enough, the blog like kind of blew up, and I got a book deal from Random House out of it when I was 27. So from there, my basketball career kind of continued to motor along, but I was already starting to build a little bit of a writing career. I wrote for ESPN for quite a while. I wrote for El País, which is a Spanish newspaper about the NBA. So it was more, I guess, organic than maybe we would have otherwise thought. It usually, I think we think of things as happening in these like chunks, right? Like, well, he was a basketball player and then he was a writer. Technically, it all kind of started at the same, not at the same time, but it started earlier maybe than might at first glance be thought.
Yeah, but I think that's the better way for things like that to happen, isn't it? Where they grow organically and it's not like, oh my gosh, this thing stopped, so I got to find something to do with my brain and my time.
Yeah, and one thing I see a lot with writers at Writer's Block is this desire to get published immediately or to have some success like right out of the gate. And I think it should be remembered that, even if you look back at my basketball career, I probably started playing basketball when I was 11 or 12, let's say, just purely for fun. And even until I was 15 or 16, it was purely, me in the backyard, mostly maybe like middle school basketball. So it didn't really quote pay off, for 5 or 6 years until I went off to college and had a chance to play college basketball. But even then, you could make the case it didn't really pay off until I was 23 and I was a pro. And I think that was very similar with writing. At first, it had to be something that was fun, right? It was something that I just wanted to do.
It is so interesting to me that I think people assume that becoming an athlete takes an enormous amount of time and effort and practice and skill building and working out. Like, people really do have this assumption that becoming a professional athlete, I think, from where I'm sitting, that
Mhm.
that requires an enormous amount of work. Whereas I don't know why people have this assumption that because I guess we can write sentences because we're taught to write as a kid, like we're taught to write in school, that that's just
Mhm.
automatically going to translate to, oh, but I should just be able to write and be published and have this huge successful career. Have you
Mhm.
seen that disconnect with, or do you know where it comes from? It's
Well,
fascinating.
I would say that I think there's a couple of different kinds of athletes, right? So for some reason, generally speaking, what I've found is that people assume that, especially basketball players and football players, that it's like a God-given thing. I think they get it when it comes to like figure skaters or gymnasts or swimmers because they're told that story during the Olympics over and over, right? That like, well, his kid's parents took her to swimming at 4 a.m. every day since she was 7. And so I get that. And I actually, sometimes when I talk about being a professional athlete, it's easier for people to get that transition between athletics and writing if I just say professional athlete. If I say professional basketball player, people then start to assume like, oh, well, you just were sort of birthed with this ability, which of course is not true. But I think it's partially because especially basketball players and football players don't look like the rest of people. We look like weirdos. Like if you were with me, you would say, well, you're 6'9" and you weigh 230 pounds. And of course you played professional basketball. And so I
And
think
your
it's hard
hands
for,
are probably 8 times the size of my hands. That's what I've noticed
right. If
every
we
time I
do
meet a
that, yeah,
basketball player. I'm like, oh, your hands are giant. Anyway, go ahead.
yeah, so I think because we have a different physiognomy, I suppose would be the word. Um, it appears that maybe we just like, well, I guess I'll just do this thing because I'm tall, which is never the case really. But I think it's harder for people to grasp. Now, with that said, I do think you're right that there is an assumption not just about writers, but about founders of businesses or restaurateurs or whatever that like, well, I know how to cook, so that guy is probably just really gifted at cooking. And you're like, no, probably he's been doing this for 15 years now. So if you really want to get into the psychology of it, I honestly think, having been on the other end of this a lot, that sometimes people want to convince themselves that other people are able to do this difficult thing, but that they aren't, and then that absolves them of any responsibility. It's a little bit of a, we talk a lot about cognitive dissonance in this world, and you don't really want to be faced with the idea that actually you could do this, but it's going to be hard, right? Or not necessarily hard, but it's going to take some commitment.
Yep.
It's sometimes easier. I mean, I used to say this about music, right? Like I always felt like I would just say, you know what? I just didn't have it because I took piano lessons from first grade to fifth grade. And then I played the trombone from sixth grade to ninth grade. And it never really connected for me. So I would say forever, like, well, I was just not musically gifted. And so that's why. Now, in reality, for whatever reason, I just didn't love it. I probably could have been good at it if I wanted to work at it, but it was easier for me to say, "Oh no, I'm just not good at music." And I think that's what the story people tell themselves sometimes is, "I'm just not a good writer," or "I'm just not a good athlete." Maybe, but most of the time, we can work at something and get to be pretty proficient at it, and that's something that actually like gets me excited when we have people at writer's block and now I'm starting this other thing called the process, which is it's talking about the ability to set up habits and routines so that you can accomplish really anything.
So it's
And
not just about writing; it's about process,
yeah,
set up,
we're moving. That's
accomplish
something.
whatever you want, kind of thing.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's like it's something that really connects back to the sports thing, right? Like we all want to achieve. I've been reading a lot about this recently. We all want to achieve what is known as flow, right? You've heard of the flow state. And that often happens when we're writing, where we lose time. We kind of can't remember where we are exactly. And it's really a high. Like there's a lot of evidence that is a true high for us. That was true for me when I played basketball. It was almost like a wrinkle in time, where you were so present that you kind of forgot where you are. And I think that's true for like, I don't think it's true. I know it's true for mountain climbers and swimmers, and it's true during sex. It's true when you have a great conversation, all of these things.
Yep.
There's nothing that's like particularly unique about sports or writing in those things. I think, it's true in sending a great batch of emails. Like if you really get locked in on like, hey, so, I got to bang these emails out and I'm going to figure out what brings me joy about this. Then it becomes not like drudgery. It's still work. And we have to remember that like, it's not like these things are going to be easy necessarily. But I think I think we if we connect back to like that love, that sense of flow, then we are able to accomplish kind of whatever we want.
Okay, you have talked about loving things a lot, which I love. I love people who are passionate about what they do because I think that's the key to so much.
Mhm.
But I have been in this debate a lot lately. I come down on a very particular side of it, but I just want to hear your point of view. Which one's more important? Obviously, I think some people do have talent, and you have to have some sort of, you did have to probably be built somewhat the way you're built in order to be able to be a basketball player, right? There's an element of that. There's an element of talent, but then there's also this element of passion. So is passion, how much, I've already heard you say passion is more important. How much more important is the passion over the talent?
Well, so I don't think it's around me, but there's this book called The Talent Code. So he talks about some of the science behind our ability to do something repeatedly and deeply. And what happens when you do something deeply and repeatedly is that your body actually like coats that synapse in myelin and makes it easier to access. And that's what I think we are talking about when we talk about passion, is that it's fun. We care about it. It's challenging enough that we feel a rewarded sense when we're done with it. But improvement comes easily enough that it's not a futile act, right? So like you said, there are certain things that I just probably would not be good at, and there are certain things that you probably wouldn't be good at, or they just don't connect in your brain. And so when we are passionate about something and do it over and over again, that's how we create what we would call talent. I don't think there's a lot of like, again, there's some predispositions for like what we care about and what we're maybe built for. Like there are people who probably are just never going to be able to hit 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Like that's just not going to be in their possible outcomes. But if you had connected early on to hitting a ball, you might have found like, well, golf is awesome, and I'm going to do that. And so maybe you couldn't hit a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, but you could hit a stationary golf ball.
I was pretty good at tennis.
Okay, right.
I got into it. Like there was a part of me that was like, when you got out there, like that flow thing you were talking about, you're hitting the ball and you're in that rhythm and you're like, man, this works.
I'm trying to see if I have that book up here. There's this great book called The Inner Game of Tennis by Timothy Galway, where he talks about specifically about tennis. He was a tennis coach, and I'm going to mangle the story, but he talks about how like for a long time he would tell people like, wow, you got to get your elbow up, and that's how you. And then one day he was like fed up with one of his students, and he's like, just hit that corner 10 times. And he was amazed at when he just let go and said, just focus on that, the person had more success. And so he started working on this theory that in our brains are self one and self two. Self one is the cognitive self, that's like, okay, so I had an appointment with Stephanie at this time and I need to be online at that time, and like kind of sets up the day. Self two is the reactive self, the self that allows you to get into that sense of flow, right? I had this introduced to me actually midway through my basketball career, because I had sort of lost sight of this when we took apart the way that I shot, like actually shooting a basketball. And one thing I had screwed up, because I tend to be pretty analytical anyway, was that I had forgotten what I loved about basketball was that ability to just lose myself in it. Much like, as you said, you probably felt that when you played tennis, right? Like that sense of like, oh my goodness, like I'm present for once, I've let go. And that's what the talent code talks about with regard to this myelinization, is if you do that enough, then our brains actually start to rewire themselves so that we desire that, and we more quickly access it. So we're able to go into it much more quickly, which I think is, again, an important thing to talk about when it comes to writing, because at the beginning, it's really awkward and ugly, right? And that's actually like, those synapses are not that well connected yet. They're like little fragile, they're like those wavy things outside of a car dealership. They just don't have any backbone yet. And then as you do it over and over and over, you just are able to get to it so quickly. Like that's one thing that I have found in the last, whatever it's been, years of really committing to a daily practice of writing. Like I'm basically in a flow state within 30 seconds of sitting down. Whereas that took, that would take 30 minutes 6 years ago or something.
It's so true. I'm lucky in a weird way. I've written every day since I was 7. Like I fell in love with it and just went, oh, I guess this is what I'm doing. This is the greatest thing I've ever done in my life. And I just never stopped. But I do see that so much in like the students I teach and the aspiring writers. They struggle. They want to feel inspired before they sit down to write, instead of sitting down to write in order to feel inspired.
Oh, totally. Yeah. I mean, you know it, I'm sure, the War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, where he talks about like, he calls it turning pro, which is when you decide like, I'm going to do this every day. And I think sometimes that can be a little off-putting because people are like, well, I'm not getting paid to do this. But I think it's turning pro even in your relationship, right? Yeah. Like deciding this relationship's important to me. And so therefore I'm going to commit to weekly date nights or regular meaningful conversations or whatever the thing is. It's deciding I'm going to do this thing regularly and commit to it. And like you're saying, what happens is that you realize that you can't wait for inspiration, that it would be criminal if you did, because you would never get anything done. And I'm just the most guilty of that. So like I thought, well, basketball, here's how it works. You do it every day and you figure out a system, what I would call a process now, that allows you to do enough so that you're prepared, but also not so much that you are destroyed by it, right? So like, it's, I think, very clear in sports and physical training that like you can only do so much each day. You can only do so much each week. That turns out to be exactly correct with writing or anything else. It's just that when I started, I had the mistaken view, like a lot of people do, that like, oh, you just wait until you feel like it, and then you write for 4 hours or whatever. Now, what I find fascinating is, I found, so let me back up. One of the way that I figured this out was by failing, of course, as is always the case. I had written Can I Keep My Jersey, and it had been released to a little bit of acclaim when I was 30, I think. And then my basketball career ended when I was 32 or 33. And I had started working on this novel in there somewhere. And then I moved to LA to get serious about it. And along about the time I was 34 or 35, I sent it to my agent, the agent I had gotten at William Morris because of my first book. And he actually took it out to publishers. He's like, actually, it's pretty good. I'm kind of surprised. I could sense in his voice, like, yeah, I thought you were a moron. So I'm amazed that you were able to do this. But all the publishers rejected it. And then I thought, well, I'll self-publish this thing. And I sent it off to a friend to edit it. And she did me the greatest favor ever of saying, like, Paul, this isn't good enough. Like, it's kind of a memoir, but it's kind of fiction. It's not really, like, it's not really good enough. And you should probably just, spike it. And I had what they would call in screenwriting circles the dark night of the soul, where I had to decide, like, am I going to keep writing or am I just going to pitch this in? And, it didn't really happen in a cemetery with a bottle of whiskey like happens in the movies. But I, over the course of a couple months, realized, like, oh shit, I know how to do this. Like, it's just like basketball. I got to commit to doing it every day within reason. So I decided, I had a girlfriend at the time, and I was like, I'm going to get up before she even wakes up, before I even eat breakfast. I'm just going to write 1,500 words every day. That actually became Stories I Tell on Dates. But more importantly, I developed this habit, this routine of writing every day before it has become like I'm really militant now about my routine. But at the beginning, it was basically just like, before I even eat breakfast, I will write 1,500 words. I had a friend in London who was trying to get up every day early. So we had this like accountability system where I would tell him the number of words I had written, and he would send me a picture of the clock in London that he had gotten up at the appropriate time. And really, that was kind of it at the beginning. It was just like accountability buddy and sort of forcing my way through it. And like we're saying, it dawned on me like, oh man, like I know how this works. Like there's just no shortcut. And what's beautiful about it, and what I'm always trying to tell people, is like, it's actually not that hard once you get through the first bit of the habit building. It's way easier than feeling guilty all week and then saying, well, I got to write for 5 hours this weekend because I didn't write all week. And then something comes up on Saturday and like, well, that day's shot. Now I haven't written for 2 weeks and I have no idea where I was in this book.
And then there's so much pressure. You're like,
yeah.
oh, I saved it all up. I better be good today, instead of just, I got to show up. Like,
yeah, totally.
Goodness.
That's you know, that's one of the reasons that I do get sort of exercised about the idea of loving it and of being passionate about it, because what happens is that at a certain point you don't even care about the finished product. You just care about like, I got to get to my chair and write for me. It's 1 hour, 6 days a week. That's it. And it's the same as when I played basketball. I would be like, I just got to get to the gym and get into this state of being. And I know it's going to be work, and I know I'm going to be tired afterward, but it's going to be a positive kind of tired where I feel fulfilled. I feel like I accomplished something. I feel like I improved. And it's exactly the same with writing, but it's also exactly the same if you were doing yoga, or if you were climbing mountains, or if you were rowing. It's always about like, how do I set up this system so that I have the fewest impedances that would keep me from getting to that flow state.
I have to ask you, where does this passion to help other people come from? Because you like light up when you start talking about this person got this lesson, or I want other people to hear this. Because basketball is a competitive, like, it's a competitive sport. You've got to be a sort of competitive guy out building a business, and you're being a writer and you're doing all this. Where does the desire to help other people do it come from? Do you know?
Some of it, I think, is feeling like an outsider a lot. Like I come from this tiny town in Kansas, and even when my family got there, I feel like there were a lot of in groups, and we always felt like the out group. And it wasn't like it was just because I was actually born in California, and then my parents moved to Kansas when I was a kid. And I think once I figured out that a lot of the time the people who had the information were very Gollum-like about having that information. Yeah. I just hated that feeling as a kid of like, I mean, it was true. Like, I was a Boy Scout, and I remember being like, why won't people just tell us what's happening? It seemed like there was this weird like monopolization of information. And I think like also, especially when it comes to writing, as a kid in a small town, I would read constantly and just felt like these authors were giving me this passport to another place. And so I think it's some combination of that, of like wanting other people to feel less alone. I think, you know, as you age, you realize like, I'm not going to accomplish enough to make myself happy, but if I can help other people, then I will be fulfilled and I will have left some kind of mark. I think, you know, the David Brooks book, The Second Mountain.
Yes.
So he talks about like, your first mountain is the ego mountain. Your second mountain is like the community mountain. And so like, I got to do the first mountain with basketball, where I was really focused on myself, right? Like, this is about my, you know, I was playing for teams, but in general, it was about my career being the best that it could be. And I got to the top of that mountain and realized well, I'm not any happier really than I was. And so now I feel like, and I have been probably for the last few years, I'm on that second mountain of like just wanting to help other people suffer less. Like we're all suffering all the time, right? So how can we get someone to suffer a little bit less? If that's giving them the tools to actually accomplish something, then I think they're suffering less, right? Like they feel a little bit more connected. They feel a little less alone.
I got to ask you one last thing before you go. You say on Twitter you're still an aspiring novelist.
Mhm.
How's it going? How's your own writing going? In other words, forget other
It's
people.
it's okay. I actually just got the proofs of my first novel comes out in February.
Oh, good,
Yeah,
excellent.
it is
Are you excited?
fittingly. Yeah, I'm excited, but like it's so different now with books because not. I mean, I'm not talking like pandemic stuff or any of that. I'm actually just like, and it's going to sound annoying when I say this, but I am so into the process that I really believe that like you just keep writing every day, and then books come out sometimes, and sometimes people read them, sometimes they don't. Um, I'm excited. You know, I got like advanced copies. I got back from Denver yesterday, and they were waiting for me, and it was exciting
Come on, that's a
in
good
a way. Yeah, but it's like I don't know. Honestly, I've gotten to this point, and this is something I tell writers a lot. Like, if you can get 10 people to read your book from start to finish, that is a win. Like,
Right.
my first book sold, I think, 40,000 copies, which is pretty good. Not, I mean, it's not like, you know, it's not like the books that are on these shelves, but that's a lot. And how many of those people actually read the whole thing?
Yeah.
1,000 maybe. And that was a book that like had an easy hook because I was an NBA basketball player and I had written a book. Like that's a really easy book to sell and a book that's easy to get into people's hands. So like if you create a work of fiction and 10 people read it from start to finish, that is you did it. So I think like my excitement is that it'll be fun to throw a party for it.
Yep.
It'll be fun to get to talk about it. And I hope that 10 people read it. And I'm not saying that just to be falsely modest. Like I think a lot of assholes will be like, "Wow." I honestly think that now, which I think is like it's only because I've again sort of seen the top of the mountain and I can realize like there's just a lot of books out there, and there's so many like personal connections that have to be made for it to actually resonate that I'd be happy with 10.
I love that. But congratulations.
Thank you.
You're downplaying it a little bit. It's exciting to have your first novel going out into the world. It's nerve-wracking. It's exciting. You created it and you're putting it out there, and 10 people or 10,000 or 10 million people read it. It's all a gift to have it out in the world. So congratulations coming out.
Story time with Stephanie Storey. Story time virtually. We've got time and plenty of stories, talking stories in a novel way. Story time with Stephanie Storey.